I'm Judy Stiles. Thank you for joining me this week on Newsmakers. Well, today we're focusing on political issues and politics, and joining me, three representatives you've seen before from the Department of Political Science here at Missouri Southern. We have Nicole Shoaf, Delehanty and Nicholas Nicoletti. Thank you for being here today. And once again, thanks for coming back. I know we've done this before, so hopefully we'll provide some information for our viewers today. It seems like everywhere you turn, there's politics in the news. You know, go to online, you click on your email, there's political news. You go to your phone, there's political news. You go to the TV and the radio. Do you feel that we're getting more of that type of coverage now, just for people to be aware of it? You know, what's your general feeling as far as how much we're hearing about politics nowadays? Is it something that people are talking about more?
I don't know if I necessarily say that. I mean, I think the degree to which it's present, like on relatively new forms of media, so social media, for example, Twitter, those sorts of things. I think the media has always been kind of constantly providing information, but maybe it's just the ease of access. Okay. And the degree to which some of the things that we're dealing with nationally in terms of our politics tend to be highly controversial. So that could explain maybe kind of the idea of having more information and being bombarded by it in a variety of different ways.
I know all three of you have you have classrooms where you meet with students. Are you finding the students are, because of this access, maybe talking about it a little bit more?
I think a little bit more, yeah, and I think some of the things that are going on right now, the Trump administration is much more interesting for the students than I saw during the Obama administration or even the George W. Bush administration at the end there. And so I think that helps a great deal, sort of having interesting things to talk about.
And you finding the same thing in your classrooms as international other aspects? They're saying, wow, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think the news cycle is faster now because of the Trump administration. So there are often so many stories breaking for the Trump administration, and there's always something going on that I think people are paying maybe more attention to sort of the sensational versus past presidents.
Okay.
Well, and not to mention, I mean, President Trump himself tries to create news by virtue of his use of social media, which kind of, maybe engenders that kind of same,
He's doing that more than any other president has done.
Yes.
Without a doubt.
Yes.
So
Yeah, very much so.
Using that as a way to reach out to the public versus I'm going to go through the media channels to reach to them, tie it together. Well, I thought today we'll talk about some of the things we've heard a lot about lately. We're recording this right after having some municipal and school board and local elections. So I'm going to start off with that. Your feelings about, we had the April elections, first week of April, and pretty low voter turnout, I guess, to start off with.
Yeah, a terribly low turnout in local elections. Sort of the only saving grace for us, I suppose, is that it's not unusual for local elections to have maybe a 10 to 15% turnout rate, which is really unfortunate because if you look at some of the individual results, you really have races that are decided by 1 to 5 people. If you can flip an election by the number of people you can fit into a compact car, that suggests that there needs to be more attention paid to what's going on at the local level.
And what stands out in your mind when you look at the results locally here in the Joplin region in this last election? Any key points that you see?
Well, I guess maybe, at least from my perspective, the failure of some of these, like a use tax, for example, in Neosho and in Carl Junction, the failure of the library tax, right, in Carl Junction, I think that was kind of interesting. But then also, right, the support of people in Joplin for the continuation of funding for city jails and those sorts of things. So it's interesting how you'd have variation in terms of the support of kind of, increased use of taxes.
So one tax that already exists continues to exist, whereas a new idea, they say, no, we don't want that. Kind of tying that together. Then we have local elections for school boards and city councils and the governmental type things. As you said, some of those were really close races.
Absolutely. I think I was flipping through the results this morning, and there was even one race that was tied for one of the smaller surrounding towns in the area. And yeah, some of these races, a lot of these people are running uncontested as well. So not only do you have really narrow margins in a couple of cases, but in some cases there's no competition whatsoever.
And I know it's been said, we've talked on previous shows about, people really, those are the topics, those government bodies that affect them more directly. The school boards that are levying taxes, the city affecting them. What can be done to get more people to care about their local elections? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think that's the most interesting part about local elections is they touch you the most, yet they have the lowest turnout. And I think, from what we know as political scientists, it's really because of media coverage or lack thereof, right? So national elections get more coverage, more people know about them. Local elections get less coverage, less people know about them, and so maybe if there was more media coverage or more people talked about those types of things, we might get a higher turnout.
So even with the social media, Facebook and so forth, people aren't necessarily generating local interest in elections through those outlets.
Yeah. Not to the same degree that you get for national elections. And a part of this is because a lot of what you see on social media also is sponsored content, right? So it's not always user generated. So we have fewer independent sources of local news now. than we have in the past, and there's far fewer independent sources of local news in general. So there's less sources for us to have access to. We don't share them as much, and very few outlets pay for a significant amount of advertising and sponsored content on social media.
So really their choices of where to get that information. Perhaps some people went to the polling place and said, who are these people I'm voting for? How do I make the decision? You know, I don't know these names. Tying that together. Well, I know next year, a year from now in April, will be the city council, Joplin City Council. Do you feel those type of elections with the bigger cities like Joplin, maybe when they have issues that people are concerned about, will bring out more voters? City council has issues, it seems like, quite a bit.
Yeah, I would expect the Joplin City Council election to have a higher turnout. And by higher, I mean, I think it'd be nice if they had a 15 or 20% turnout. I still wouldn't expect it to come anywhere near, say, a midterm election turnout. But we'll also be messing with primary elections next year as well for some of these races, and that should help spike some turnout as well.
So this is kind of an off year when you look at 2019. It's not the big national focus. People kind of step back and say, why am I going to the polls?
Well, that's part of the problem too. I mean, you don't have this nice. If they work together in the same kind of time frame, that would probably also boost turnout or at least interest.
Yeah. Well, in the United States, we're asked to vote a lot between general elections, primary elections, these off-year local elections. We're asked to go and vote very frequently, and there's an expectation that we are supposed to get informed for all of these different elections, and so it's asking an awful lot of the voter as well.
Whereas other places, they have an election day and it covers all levels of government many times.
Definitely, and sometimes there's even strategy involved in when you put certain initiatives up in a given election, because we know that voter turnout either drives yeses or nos in some cases on those initiatives, and so if you get a low voter turnout, those people might think differently on an issue, maybe vote no if you do want to kill it or something like that.
So I know when I was at the polling place myself, there was somebody standing there and said, maybe we should go to voting on Sundays. Change the whole thing, way we're doing things in the United States. We've had this pattern for, I don't know how many years you've been saying Tuesday's the election day. What about that feeling of people maybe suggesting change?
Well, I mean, you could. I mean, I guess the question is, so if you have an election on, like, say, a holiday or, a weekend, I mean, it may boost turnout in the sense that it gives a great opportunity to vote, but at the same time, would we necessarily see people participating more? I mean, there's still an opportunity cost. Even if you were to remove work, there are other things that people may want to do. There's some other interesting kind of reforms that we talked about in class. For example, mandatory voting, right? Which would obviously boost turnout, but then has questions about quality of participation. So there's been lots of reforms that have been proposed. Some of them just seem to struggle with the other things that people have to do in their lives. Not to say that voting would be less important, but it's just kind of weighing out, right, those things we want to do.
People have to weigh their time values.
Yeah. Well, Washington State does all their elections via mail today. So you get a ballot in the mail, you have a couple weeks to fill it out, you drop it back into the mail at your leisure, the postage is prepaid for you. So something like that would be an easy way. If the state of Missouri was actually committed to increasing turnout and accessibility for voters, that's an easy approach to take.
What about the use of technology in elections? We have our email, electronic devices for everything. Do you see a day when you don't have to go to a polling place to vote, that would play a role for voting in the future?
If you could overcome the fear of sort of hacking or tampering with an election. But I mean, comparatively, from a comparative politics perspective, most advanced industrial democracies do make elections a holiday. They have automatic voter registration, so there isn't this onus on the individual to register to vote. Many of them allow voting by mail, right, to ease the cost. And in many of these countries, it is compulsory, like in Australia. And you get, voter turnout rates of 80, sometimes 90% in most of these countries. So the United States does fall below most advanced industrial democracies on voter turnout.
To try to get that turnout, because the way to do it. And we also heard a lot about voter ID. It's something we heard about that came around even this time, before people went into the polls. Well, here's what you need to do if you want to vote. What's your feeling about the status of the voter ID situation here in Missouri? What are we looking at?
Well, I mean, I guess from one perspective, I mean, I guess the broader question of voter ID is the justification for it and the reasons why we would need, right, those kind of voter IDs. I mean, generally the logic is to avoid fraud, but I think, and I asked my colleagues, I think the incidence of fraud in American elections is incredibly low. So it's not entirely clear the necessity, right, of the voter ID. And I mean, to Dr. Nicoletti's point, if you require a positive ID, I mean, it's going to probably also have a damping effect on turnout. So it's kind of an interesting political question, why it is that we would want to pursue those kinds of reforms or those kind of changes.
It's a partisan question
Of course
in the United
it is.
States
Of course it
because
is.
there are segments of the population that do not have identification.
Right.
Identification is a cost that you have to pay, and so lower socioeconomic status individuals often do not have photo IDs. Those people often do vote for the Democratic Party. So voter ID laws are often, championed by the Republicans, and on the other side, the Democrats tend not to like them, primarily because turnout is a hugely important thing in elections. They suppress some people and not others, right? So that's why it's become a huge political issue.
It really becomes a politics that people are concerned about. Well, going beyond elections, of course, we went to the local level, the state of Missouri. We didn't have any elections, but there's a lot happening in Jefferson City. The legislature is underway right now. Any observations? We're a month or so before them ending their session. We hear talk about the budget, transportation funding. What are some of the key items that Missourians need to be thinking about or hearing about from Jefferson City?
Well, I mean, actually, it was kind of interesting when we were talking about transportation funding. So there was general revenue that was taken from the legislature to pay for infrastructure repair, which apparently has not been kind of the norm in the past. There's been dedicated funds associated with paying for those. So some of the legislators are talking about using new strategies for meeting fiscal demands. There's also been debates about revenue targets, and there's been questions about the Department of Revenue being able to accurately estimate those revenue targets. So there's still questions about the fiscal viability of the budget going forward. So it's something to kind of pay attention to.
And of course that affects everything, so even down at the university level and lower, higher, K through 12 as well. What kind of money is going to be there for those organizations next year? And so, for the voters' perspective, they're not voting this time on the people in Jefferson City, but they still need to be aware of these issues they're discussing.
Absolutely. The bills that they're considering right now will go into effect and affect us all, whether we want to pay attention or not. So yeah, keeping informed about what's going on is important, and we shouldn't overestimate how much contact state legislators get from their constituents. And so if you hear about something that concerns you, that you're excited about and think it's a great idea, or you're concerned about and you think that maybe it's not a good idea, contacting your state legislator is both really easy and can have a really big impact at the local level like this.
I know a lot of the local, especially state legislators, will send out emails or even have printed newsletters. Their efforts to try to reach those constituents.
Yeah, and provide information so that way people can presumably make informed choices, but also kind of generate support for the people that send them. We also, pay for those too. In the form of kind of subsidy for legislators too. So it's an important way to kind of convey relevant information to voters.
It's important for them to find out what the people are thinking. They're representing some large districts. There's a lot of people. They don't know what's the general feeling of the people I'm representing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tying all of those together. When you look at then Jefferson City, we do have the situations we had last year with the Republican government. Kind of both sides. Tying. Do you see has that affected Missouri much at all as far as having this, nonpartisan type of House and Senate and governor?
I don't know. There's been some, obviously some problems, partisanship-wise, with the House and with the legislature and the governor. It does seem like the Republican Party, given their supermajorities, really kind of gets the opportunity to set the agenda for Missouri going forward. And the question is whether or not Missourians support that agenda. It's kind of an open question, but they at least have the political power currently. And I'm not sure the Democrats are going to make inroads in the state legislature anytime soon.
What about the role of redistricting? Missourians voted last year to say, well, when we make those lines next time, to divide the districts, we're going to take a different approach to that. Any feelings about that, how that might affect Missouri?
It'll be interesting to see how it's done, particularly because there are some state legislators who are working on proposals that would modify what was passed by the voters in the last election. So it depends upon how it's implemented when the time comes around, I would argue.
It's really important, right? Because every 10 years with the census, the General Assemblies, especially ones that have supermajority, one party or another, can redraw the districts where they pack them, right? And so that marginalizes, in Missouri it would marginalize Democratic voters. In other states, like New York, it often marginalizes Republican voters. And so we just had a ballot initiative to sort of reform that in a positive way. And if that doesn't get followed through, right, it won't be as balanced. And I think there's some stuff to watch out for in the Supreme Court level too, as they decide whether gerrymandering is even constitutional, although they've been kind of, baby stepping around the issue for some time. But it is pretty clear that gerrymandering disrupts the one person, one vote sort of idea, as it allows for partisan packing.
Now, people may recall, last November as well, if they voted on things such as the marijuana laws and so forth. I've heard some people say, well, when are those going to take effect? Some of the voters think, well, didn't we pass that medical marijuana in Missouri? So how do you, communicate to the public, okay, this was approved, but this is the steps we have to go through to make it happen?
I mean, it's come up with all sorts of bureaucratic rules to actually put into practice what the voters vote on. And actually, it's interesting. There's been some kind of interest at the state level also about reforming, the initiative petition process. Maybe in light of, the petitions that ultimately were approved by the voters. But there's always this delay. But I guess the question is, how long is the delay? Is the legislature going to kind of, if you will, kind of use its interest to kind of change, or modify ultimately what voters supported? So it'll be kind of interesting to see how they actually implement the thing over time.
Amendment 2 had a pretty concise timeline, though, and so far it does look like the timeline is being followed. I mean, right now what's happening is the medical marijuana grow licenses are being distributed. So there's only a select number of those, and so they have to figure out how to distribute those. And then because you can't import marijuana, you have to grow it in your own state, so it will take time to cultivate. And so most people are estimating by early to mid 2020, the process will be underway where medical marijuana could start being distributed.
Okay. So for just a lot of the citizens, they don't understand that time process. They, it doesn't happen overnight, obviously, but what are the steps you have to go through in making those things happen? So you think the initiative petition is something that the lawmakers in Jefferson City aren't completely sold on, and they have that opportunity to.
Well, I mean, I think
the way to say it that way.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of debate, and Dr. Nicoletti can also comment on this too. I mean, the direct democracy has both benefits and costs, and I mean, to the degree that the legislature would disagree with the choice of the voters, I mean, they may want to make that process more difficult or more onerous, or maybe not. But Missouri is one of a few states. I think California, for example, also that kind of employs this initiative process. So it's empowering, but the legislature may at some point want to kind of reevaluate the nature of the petition process.
So we're one of a few states. People don't realize that where the citizens can really start that process.
About half of the country has it. About 23, 24 states have it. As you guys might know, the original framers of the Constitution did not like direct democracy. They feared the tyranny of the majority. So if you look at sort of the East Coast and the South, the petitions and initiatives and referendums are just not there. But as states started forming westward, the populist and progressive movement started to push for the breakup of party machines. And one of the ways that they wanted to destroy the party machine is by putting democracy in the hands of the people, and that's where the initiative and referendum come from. And it is a double-edged sword, because while it does allow you to circumvent the legislature, it also does allow for the tyranny of the majority, which often shifts rather rapidly and isn't always as well thought out, and so it's an interesting process.
So it has its pros and cons.
Yeah,
People to be aware of it and tying that. So, well, early in the show, you talked about the Trump administration, national topics. And that's obviously a lot of people are talking about that, whether wherever you're at. What do you see? Every day we turn on the newspaper, turn on the television, radio, read the newspaper. Immigration, border concerns. What are some of the key topics that you think that are really hitting us right now on the national level that we're trying to concern with things?
Well, I mean, one of the current debates now is this kind of rhetorical claim that we would close the southern border,
close the border,
which I think logistically is impossible, but sounds kind of appealing on the part of the Trump administration. I'm just not sure to what degree there's any way to follow through on a policy claim like that in conjunction with the declaration of an emergency situation. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, ultimately, President Trump overrode congressional rejection of the declaration. So it will be kind of an interesting institutional dynamic kind of going into at least 2020.
So it's just going to be continuing. We're going to continue to look at that as coming along.
It'll keep happening. And I mean, shutting the Mexican border would be a disaster for trade and be a disaster for prices and pretty much a disaster for the economy. But I think what's really interesting is that Congress stepped up its game and really did check the president as the checks and balances were intended, and of course the veto overrides. So now we look to the courts and see how that process plays out. But this is still dynamic and ongoing.
So it's going to go on down the road to the courts to make a decision to see what's really going to happen.
Yeah,
make that final decision. What about the long investigation? When that came out, we finished the Mueller report. Everybody's saying, okay, now what happens in Washington next? Any thoughts about that? People are saying, okay, we've had 2 years of saying you're investigating. Now we say, okay, we have some results.
Well, I'm kind of interested to see if there will be any public release of at least portions of the report. Because I mean, the language you're hearing is there'll be some public disclosure. Obviously, we wouldn't get the full report. The results suggest that there wasn't collusion. So it'll be interesting to see what's released and ultimately how that release is framed, right, for the broader public, particularly because Trump has made a very big argument that there was no collusion, and so the Mueller report in that sense kind of exonerates him. But I don't know.
The House Democrats subpoenaed for the report today. They'd like the full thing. I think we'll probably get it redacted heavily. But even though the report may conclude no collusion, it is interesting to note that there were well over a dozen people who were charged, found guilty, and or pled guilty to many charges, including campaign stuff and also lying and withholding information. So the Mueller report is interesting in the sense that it's not empty-handed, right? It didn't come out empty-handed, but the president isn't necessarily implicated. But even so, if you look at the current public approval, his approval's down since the report was released, down further than it's been down because it's often,
it's been low, right?
Yeah, so it is an interesting revelation.
Well, and there are other investigations at the state level also. I mean, in New York, for example, where I mean, there's an open question about the indictment of a sitting president and those sorts of things. So those legal questions are kind of still left
hanging over things.
Yes, and so I mean that's the reason why I was mentioning the framing. I mean, so the question is how will Trump kind of discuss via Twitter and other places the consequences of the report? And you're right. How will the Democrats ultimately try to maybe use the release of the report to their political advantage going into 2020?
So obviously we have that political division on the parties and their point of view on that report and tying it together. We'll talk about parties. You mentioned primaries in a year. People are already throwing their hat in the ring for the election for the Democrats, especially, I want to be president. What's your reaction to that? The number of people, the timing, what's going on there?
Yeah, this gets earlier and earlier. So primaries will actually start voting in January of 2019. Not here in Missouri, but Iowa, New Hampshire will start voting then. So this is the season that we call the invisible primaries. Everything that happens before we actually start voting. And so it's not, in the modern era, it's not really unusual for people to throw their hats in the ring this early. There's an unusually large number of candidates, and on the Democratic side, it's a really diverse group of candidates, which I think is going to make for some really interesting discussions. It's no longer the case this year that there's one female candidate, right? So she doesn't have to have the burden of representing all women from all positions. There are multiple women running for the same nomination. There's an openly gay candidate for the first time for the Democrats. Cory Booker, African-American senator, is running as well. And so there's a tremendous amount of diversity, which should lead to some more interesting conversations, I think.
So how do all these candidates, we've got so many that have their hat in the ring already, create that awareness, just who they are? The voters who are going to be going to those primaries in January, like, who are all these people?
Well, some of them are name recognition. I mean, so you have, Joe Biden. So I mean, being a former vice president, a prominent senator, that kind of helps. I think it's maybe also, I mean, most of them, let's see, so Harris is a senator, Booker's a senator. So I mean, they already have have national recognition that way. The other thing that's interesting about the nomination, too, is the degree to which it reveals kind of a generational divide in the Democrats. I mean, you have younger, non-white, right, people seeking the nomination. It may, in fact, indicate that the Democratic Party is shifting, in part, kind of maybe its preferences for a certain type of candidate. That the old guard maybe no longer has the same kind of control over the leadership of the Democratic Party. It'd be kind of interesting to see if that's true.
So how the party itself is shifting with its points of control and time together.
I think that's right. I mean, strategically, if you look at this election, many of the Democratic candidates are pushing the party more and more left, right? And no matter how you feel about the left-right ideological spectrum, one thing that we do know is that socialism is a bad word in the United States, and it's been so since well before the Cold War. And so the more we push the party that way, the more the Republicans are capitalizing on this idea of high taxes, socialized medicine, socialized government. And even if that is something that would be beneficial, the framing of that is often fairly negative. And so strategically, I think that a very wide dais for the Democratic Party could hurt them early on. And you actually are seeing people like Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, and others presenting bills, using their power in their positions to present bills that are doing things that would have the government solving social ills by spending a lot more money than I think generally moderate Americans are willing to do. So
it's already kind of stirring things up through those proposals. Internationally, I know we don't have a lot of time, but a lot happening worldwide. We talked about the U.S.-Mexico situation, but we're United Kingdom. People are, what's going to happen over there with that Brexit situation? What's going to happen around the world?
Brexit is fascinating. I think that's one of the big stories right now. the Parliament just keeps postponing it and asking for more time, and they're just not passing Theresa May's plan, and it doesn't even seem like she wants her own plan to be passed. And so there's a couple things that could happen here. They can get another extension and rework the deal, but they can get an extension and then ask for a second referendum, which is what some people are demanding. And if they did that, I'm pretty sure the Remain vote would win the second referendum, which would be a huge waste of time, 2 years and some change in Brexit, but we'll see how that unfolds.
Great. So a lot of national items, international items. And before we wrap up today, I also want to mention your department is very involved in a new initiative here at Missouri Southern, starting in the fall, a special civics exam, I guess, that the state of Missouri said we're going to implement.
Yes, and so all incoming freshmen in the fall will have to complete a civics exam that focuses on the naturalization test and then also a Missouri Constitution component. And so we're in the process of kind of developing a Blackboard, which is our learning management software. Test site where you have videos and modules that expose students to the information, and then ultimately they get to take the test in the context of that Blackboard experience. So myself, I've been writing some of the scripts, and Judy, you've worked with me on those as well.
Right.
So yeah, we're kind of in the process, but it doesn't go into full implementation until the fall, so we're still kind of in the process of getting it done.
And you mentioned the naturalization. I know I've seen a lot of statistics that say people who have lived in the United States all their life couldn't pass that test that people who want to become naturalized citizens pass.
Yeah, it's very difficult. So I mean, in that sense, we're trying to give students enough information so they can learn it, but then also kind of appreciate the information at the same time.
So, and all three of you working with the students in the classroom, do you find it enjoyable when that light bulb clicks and they understand, well, that's why things work? That's how our country really works.
Absolutely. When you have students who walk in and go, well, I don't care, I hate politics, I don't want to be involved in this, and then you help them understand sort of how it affects them and how they can have an impact, and they sort of walk away with an interest. They may not want to run for office, but when they have enough interest that they can be sort of active, involved citizens, it's fantastic to see.
So carry through lifetime skills for them and so forth. And of course, you probably have graduates as well that have gone on to those political endeavors or perhaps working in government and so forth as well.
Very much so, yeah.
Tying that together. Well, I thank the three of you, for sharing some information. And I guess we always say to become an informed citizen, people need to do that not only at the college level, but all levels of their life.
Absolutely.
And keep tying.
Democracy only works with an informed population.
So, pay attention to that media and make that decision based on many factors as well. Tying that together. Well, thank the three of you for joining me today on Newsmakers and sharing some information with our audience.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I'd like to thank you for joining us this week on Newsmakers. I'm Judy Stiles. Hope you can join me again next week at the same time on this station. We'll see you then.